basket, which is what about this multiracial category? It will probably grow over time, but the interesting thing is that there has not been a huge increase since the year 2000 in the percent of people marking themselves as multiracial. We would have predicted that that would have gone up in the... There's essentially a new census called the American Community Survey, which is a smaller sample done every year. We would have projected that that would increase over time for many of us because of our consciousness, etc. It isn't really. So the best projection is straight line it, just because we don't quite know yet what's going to happen with that, but we might imagine it might get bigger. But the story in California really is that the basically the two groups trading places are Latinos and Anglos in terms of their demographic numbers in the state. By the year 2035, we'll be a majority Latino state, which means that people will have to learn how to say California the right way. Los Angeles will once again become Los Angeles, and Oakland will be just Oakland. So, if we move to the next slide, what you can see that what's driving that, here in the blue again are the Anglo population. What's interesting about this is it's not just that the share of Anglos is going down, but that the sheer number of Anglos is projected to go down in the state because of a combination of lower birth rates and a tendency to increasingly out-migrate from the state. Sometimes when I'm with friendly crowds, am I? Yeah. I say, wait people, what's wrong with you? Why are you leaving? It's a great state. What we're seeing is that sheer increases in the percent in the numbers of Latinos, decreases in the numbers of Anglos, increases in the percents and the shares, the numbers of African Americans and Asians. That's pretty steady in terms of its share in the population. Next slide. I know that you're from all over the state, so this is a map of the higher percent Latino in the population by California counties. And here, the browner the county, the browner the county. And if you click to the next slide, 2010, next slide, 2020, 2030, 2040, 2050. So if you don't have a taqueria near you now, you will. Don't worry, Ayuda is coming. That means help. Okay, so huge demographic change, and it's occurring all over the state, projected to occur all over the state. Next slide. In some important ways, though, the future is now. And this is a slice of the population in 2000. Hasn't changed much for the 2005, 2006, 2007 American Community Surveys. But here, it's broken out by age. And so for the population, for example, that's 65 years old or older, that population is about 71% white or Anglo. What's true about that population, 65 years old or older? That's a really depressing answer. These people are going, they'll be dead soon, right? Actually, that's what my students say, and that worries me because I'm in that next group, right, 40 to 65, 40 to 64. But what's true about that group is that it's high voting, right? And so is the group right below it in terms of age category, because they tend to be higher income and high voting. But for really old people, man, they vote, right? Like every time you go to vote someplace and you notice who's a poll worker, right? I mean, it's like a major day at the rest home, right? When election day comes around, right? So to that population above the age of 40 is about 2/3 white, deciding the future of a population under the age of 18. It's about 2/3 kids of color, and that's what I call California's generation gap. We used the term generation gap during the 1960s to refer to different cultural characteristics in terms of youth culture, to relationship to the Vietnam War, etc. This generation gap is another kind of generation gap, and I think it has important implications for the future. Next slide. We did a study for the Public Policy Institute of California, in which we essentially tried to take a look at what the impact of that generation gap was on the tendency of states to engage in spending on the future capital outlays. Because this was an academic publication, by the way, when I said generation gap, did everybody understand that? because this was an academic publication, we couldn't use such an accessible term. And instead, we changed it to demographic divergence. Far more syllables. So the bigger the demographic divergence, the lower the investment on state-level spending on capital investments for the future. So where there's a bigger disconnect between the old and the young, there's less investment in the future. This is something that Peter Schrag wrote about in a really great book, Paradise Lost, about California and the loss of our investment in the future, etc. And it's something that seems to be borne out in the statistics as well. And it's something that we cannot repair by changing the demographics. We have to repair this by changing the connections, by changing the story that we tell ourselves. And at the end of this talk, I'll try to talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. So while we've had this huge demographic change, we've also become more unequal. This is a state which prided itself on being a place where people would come to make their own futures. My parents arrived in California had just been born actually, I was about 6 months old. They moved from New York to California to Los Angeles. They moved here to LA actually because my sister had asthma and the doctors there prescribed a wonderful air in Southern California as a good thing for you. This was the era in which doctors were saying that Camel filters were just really good, right? It would sort of soothe the throat. So they, like many others, moved here for opportunity. We are now, if you compare the top fifth to the bottom fifth of families, the sixth most unequal state in the country, according to the Economic Policy Institute. If you think about the top 5% to the bottom fifth, we're the eighth most unequal state, and we're becoming more unequal faster than 32 other states, including such paragons of progressive virtue as Arkansas and Mississippi, places we've always looked to as beacons of social justice. Now, this does have a racial dynamic to it. These are poverty rates for California, and thank you, Ajay. The poverty rates here are 150% of the poverty rate. You may know that the poverty level for a family of four in the state of California is about $19,000, which that's not poor, that's total, right? So many economists are now using 150% of the poverty rate, sort of $27,000 for a family of four, which most of us would consider to be fairly low income in high-cost California. By that margin, 36% of Latinos fall below the poverty line, about 29% of African Americans. The Asian poverty rate is higher than it is for whites because that is a population which, on the one hand, has higher median incomes for a household level, but also has higher poverty rates because it's a very bifurcated population, one that has some high skill and very well-placed community members, and one that has more recent arrivals and many people facing tough problems. Now, when some people see that graph, the immediate thing that comes to mind is that the Latino poverty rates are driven largely, one might think, by immigration. That is, that they are a function of people who come to the country, they're poor, they expect to be poor, they understand that they will be poor when they get started, and they are hoping that over time their incomes will go up and their children will do better. Next slide. So this compares the household income of US-born Anglos, US-born Latinos, and immigrant Latinos in California in the same time period. It's true that immigrant Latinos are bringing up the bottom of the income profile at about 60 cents on the dollar for what white families make. But even for US-born Latinos, it's about 80 cents on the dollar, about a 20% gap in terms of income. While not the only explanation, the bulk of that is explained by a difference in educational outcomes. There are other factors that are important, including continuing discrimination, what are called network effects, basically who you know and who that connects you to in the labor market, and a variety of other things. But the bulk of that is from education and educational differences, and it's something why the work that you're doing is so important. Next slide. Now, I love, but you know, one of the things that's a challenge when you teach at a university is that sometimes your cultural references are really old, right? So if you use, say, Ozzie and Harriet, right? People look